experience are sellers are saying, you know, pre-COVID, I had a pretty good situation. Values were great. So if I can ride this out, I think my values are going to recover. We have a lot of buyers on the sidelines with a lot of capital ready to deploy, looking for high returns. And I would say there's a gap between buyer and seller. Fast forward from April into May, post Memorial Day, we've got the start of the civil unrest across the country. That has kind of compounded the issues. I think has largely pushed anyone that was going to transact. It's just hard to tell what the behavior is going to be in terms of the end user. And then if you pick your head up and look forward, we're less than 90 days from a U.S. election. So, and any one of those would have an impact and a profound impact on transactions. And so we've got this kind of perfect recipe of three storms brewing and or already hitting, affecting the transaction world. And from a buyer's perspective, they want to be able to underwrite and understand what their property is going to do and what the risks are. And I would say it's just been difficult to do that.
So Brent, when you talk about everybody basically sitting on the sidelines now due to this triple perfect storm, or less than perfect storm, I would say, how much value has been lost in commercial markets today?
Well, that's a great question, and that's the $1 million question, right? And you know, it ranges from you know, maybe slightly down to some properties are down over 20% if we had to throw a number at. And really, I think what you have to do is have the appetite to take the risk and to quote unquote ride out the storm, and then we'll see recovery. I mean, we will see recovery. It's just a matter of when and how quickly.
And I would think that industrial is being less impacted due to all the home shoppers that we all are now, and all the deliveries that come to our door every day. So talk a little bit about the industrial market.
So industrial, first of all, pre-COVID was doing quite well, right? There are a lot of deliveries coming online, and then with the onset of the home shopping, the quarantine, the stay-at-home orders, a lot of people moved to online ordering, which in my mind, it kind of accelerated what we had already seen, both on the retail side of it, but also on the industrial and kind of what we call the last mile delivery on the logistics side. Now, if we think about warehouse, flex, and kind of the industrial outside of the last mile, I think what we need to be mindful of is consumer spending is going to have a large impact on industrial and how those properties do. And so if we have an economy that recovers and starts to grow, industrial is going to do fine. We might see values come down a little bit over the next year or so, but they'll recover. But if economic headwinds are sustained and you know, job losses mount and people start pulling back their spending, that's going to be a huge issue. It's also going to be compounded potentially by bankruptcies, right? As bankruptcies go, companies need less industrial real estate.
Well, speaking of bankruptcies, and we hope we don't see a lot of them, but lack of travel, and we've all had our wings clipped this summer in terms of taking trips and being on the airlines and staying in hotels. So how is the lodging market doing at this point, and how are they going to recover?
So the lodging market obviously is taking a large brunt of this initially. The stay-at-home orders, the travel ban, the home quarantine, all of things kind of compounded. And so there's a key metric that we use in that space, and it's revenue per available room. And that's a great metric because it's revenue divided by the number of room nights available. And that number is down kind of depending on which owner you talk to, but it can be as close to 90%, so down 90%. So that is a significant reduction. A very good client of ours, large hotel REIT, and he said, Brent, you know, we could sustain a 20 or 30% decline, but we were not equipped or prepared to go to zero. So it's obviously been a huge issue. The good news is occupancy has steadily increased. Drive-to properties have seen strong demand. And we think that's going to sustain itself at least through Labor Day. It kind of depends on what the schools do. And if we stay with this remote learning, families might take advantage of last-minute vacations to drive to resorts. I think the larger issue is if I'm a hotel owner and operator, are the more the transient occupancy. So those would be those traveling, whether for business, personal, or otherwise, maybe not leisure related. I think those properties are going to struggle. We just had a portfolio of properties that are Midwest based, all select or limited service, very geared towards business travel. So think of you know, a Comfort Inn or some select service hotel adjacent to a business park. Those properties are going to struggle, you know, for the time being. And I think it's important to, you know, there was talk of a vaccine coming out. I've heard October. Supposedly Russia had one after 2 hours of testing. So I just don't know. And you know, just because if a vaccine comes out today doesn't mean consumer behavior changes tomorrow. It's not going to be so binary. So I think we're going to see an impact on the lodging industry for some time.
Well, the Zoom calls, in my mind, have become the new normal. I mean, my meetings are so easy now because nobody has to get on a plane. You don't have to work around people's travel schedules. Everybody's in the same room, so to speak.
I had lunch in Chicago. I'm talking to DC. I got New York next. It's fantastic.
Right. It's all good. So Kassi, let's switch over and talk a little bit about the impact COVID has had on the office market.
Sure. So right now, you know, for the most part, office collections, you know, they aren't seeing much distress in terms of non-payment of rent or the bankruptcies, you know, that sort of real distress yet. But the office market is right now basically segmented into two camps. It's either, you know, core plus, very, very much core, shelving towards core with credit tenants is in demand. And the real, you know, distress, quote unquote, is in some of the value add projects. And also it just as because, and we can touch on this later, but because the lack of available financing. So a lot of office owners are, you know, seeing demand in suburban product, not as much on the urban product. Investors at Newmark, for example, you know, we've seen our office tallies are about a 70% decline in overall transactions, and about 71% decline in office transactions. Our local team here in DC is headed by Judd Ryan and James Cassidy. Only have a couple assets on the market right now, where before COVID, you know, they had probably 10 or 12 that were active. We are getting ready to close a deal, or just getting one signed up, where it's a very strong credit tenancy, suburban profile, and there was a ton of investor, you know, demand for that profile. The value add story is a little more complicated, given the big question is, where's leasing demand going to come from? And what is the tenant going to do at the end of their lease? Are they going to renew? Are they going to increase space with all the COVID concerns? And you know, anything, and of course, anything spec office is very difficult to get built right now. And new construction for office is fairly challenging. So that's sort of, you know, my 2 cents and kind of what we're seeing today in the office space.
It's too bad we aren't having polling to see how many people are going to be going back to the office versus continuing to work remotely. Because I think working remotely has been amazingly successful for many of us. So Kassi, in the news recently, Mazda Gallery on the blocks. So retail is struggling. And can you address what's happening in the retail market from your perspective?
Yes, and it's unfortunate that there just some stress is just being compounded with retail, given that there were headwinds with bricks and mortar, clicks versus bricks, a year or two prior, and then with COVID, causing the shift to online sales, all the bricks and mortar has been adversely impacted. So sort of again, tale of two stories. If it's and I'll touch on some nuances, but if it's grocery anchored, and maybe you've got a CVS or a Walgreens, and that is actually in very much high demand. So grocery anchored, credit tenancy, convenience such as CVS, very high demand. The big boxes, I think we all have seen Pier 1, J. Crew, for some of these bigger national retailers that are struggling. Those are really impacting. The more obviously malls have had some distress for some time, but even the neighborhood centers that have the mom and pop retailers, even if they're national credit or their local credit, lenders are still very, very skittish, and deals are getting done at maybe 50% leverage, if that. We've heard of some cases of 40%, and for our retail guys, Matt Adler, who's our practice locally, even they are saying, real, questions about who's paying rent, or do you have to at least, restructure? Is it going to come back? So everyone kind of had this April, May, June deferral of rent, but is that going to happen again if you have to, the certain governments and certain jurisdictions start shutting back down again? And I would say the one interesting with retail this time around, as many of you know, a lot of your major national credit tenants weren't paying. It was big news when Cheesecake Factory said, we're not going to pay you rent. They've obviously made all these profits, year after year. So there's been some, dialogue back and forth there, as well as with, I think Adidas threatened not to pay, and then they sort of came back to the table. So, that sector is largely stagnant right now, because I think buyers want a huge discount, and sellers, you really just trying to figure out, how do you value this? And who's going to be there in 6 months. And I do think, with the point Brent touched on, was bankruptcies are going to continue to just play that sector, and we will see more of them.
So it almost sounds like the old-fashioned strip center has got a better chance of survival than the big malls, because they do have the CVS, the grocery, the Starbucks, and maybe a pizza parlor. Yeah.
And it's service. You can't buy a pizza off Amazon. Maybe they're gonna have Amazon pizza soon, but you can't do that right now, or get your hair cut at an Amazon. So certain things like that are gonna survive. The malls are just in a world of distress with we all know JCPenney, Neiman, Sears, and then it's a domino effect, because you have co-tenancy clauses, and the malls are, by and large, just a really distressed asset class right now. They're one of the larger percentages of the retail's loans that are in distress in the CMBS sector right now. And people are looking at alternative ways to use that retail space, whether it's for a school, maybe some sort of healthcare, some sort of office. But there's definitely a trend of, I guess before COVID, a gym like Planet Fitness. There's definitely different ways of thinking about how to redevelop and get the highest and best use from a lot of these malls that have been suffering from some time. It just kind of got dealt a death blow here from COVID.
Right. Multifamily. I think that still seems to be doing okay, but I'd love your perspective.
Sure. Multifamily is definitely, I think along with industrial, probably your two best performing asset classes right now. Transactions are still down, again, because you have a bid-ask gap between the buyers and the sellers. But in most cases, rents, and I know there's a lot of media headlines about people not paying rents or having that, and not being able to foreclose and evict and all that stuff. but multifamily rent right now is Newmark. We just published a report, 95% collections right now, and it's for July. It is a very strong sector. You know, I think even the luxury product is holding up as more people are working from home. And the you know, more affordable segment, people still need a place to live. Maybe they're doubling up. But a lot of our properties and owners are still reporting, you know, rents in the even in the upper 90% collections. And the big thing about the multifamily side is the financing is being primarily propped up by the agencies. Fannie and Freddie are, as you know, government-backed entities. They are just, you know, really offering attractive, you know, financing terms right now. And some of the COVID clauses and requirements, you know, that were enforced or being, you know, required are now not, as we're sort of, you know, hopefully kind of, you know, veering out of this period.
Brent, I know that you had a great discussion today with an investor in student housing, and it has been a little scary when you think about half the universities aren't opening and a lot of people aren't sending their kids back to school if they have the opportunity to learn remotely, if they can do it that way instead of being on campus. But what did you learn today about the student housing sector?
Well, there's still a lot of optimism in that sector, and a large part of that is, and for those of us with teenagers, they're the smartest people in the room, right? And so they want to be near their peers, and they want to be on or near campus. And so even if the institution has gone to a remote learning scenario, they still want to socialize, be next to or near their peers. So they're still going to campus. We also see situations where the university and their own capacity are only using maybe 50 or 60% because they're putting rooms between students. And so what they're doing is approaching these private owners of student housing saying, hey, we need extra capacity because we're using only 50 or 60% in our own stock.
Oh, that's interesting. And that's the other, you know, the whole thing about going back to work and office space, whether tenants are going to need more space or less space, depending on whether everybody's going back, but you have to maintain social distancing. It's really going to be interesting to see how this all plays out 6 months from now. So let's talk a little bit about suburban versus urban markets and what's happening and how COVID has influenced people's thinking. And I'll share one thing. One of my retail clients said that those mom and pops that they don't think will end up coming back to their grocery anchored strip center, that they're thinking about turning some of that space into office space for people that don't want to have the drive downtown. They've been able to work at home and save themselves that hour or 2 hour commute. And will there be, how is that all going to evolve in terms of what are your predictions for urban versus suburban? Kassi, you want to lead? Oh, go ahead, Brent.
Yeah, Brent.
Jump in.
Well, is this being recorded? Because if it is, no, I'm just kidding.
It is.
So I think we'll see a short-term shift in behavior. So you'll see a hub and spoke on the office side. I think you might even see a bump in the co-working or shared space where companies will temporarily lease space out for their employees at, you know, near their residential dwellings. I think, you know, the retail play is interesting. At my lunch today, it was interesting because this investor was asking me, have you heard of these educational pods? So people, and people had approached just me for my family and our children, but people are setting up these pods and then going to these strip centers and doing these month-to-month rentals so they can have their school pods in these small spaces for rent that's pretty reasonable.
And
anyway,
free parking.
So I think we're going to see a short-term shift and flight to the suburbs, and maybe some people stay. But I go back to my student housing commentary and that discussion. and those students wanting and going back to school to be near their peers, I think that's going to continue post-graduation. So in 3 to 4 years, we're going to see those students moving because they want to live and work, near each other. So more urban. They like the urban amenities. So I think short term, we'll see a flight to the suburbs, but I think long term we're going to end back kind of where we were. So I mean, we're talking like maybe in 5 years, right? Not in 12 months.
Wow. Well, we can't hold our breath that long. We're just going to have to be patient with that.
Yes.
Kassi, what's your take on suburban versus urban?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Brent. I don't know if it'll be 5 years out for a shift. Most of our clients think it's going to be probably more balanced, and especially this kind of bump to get through the short term. One of our major clients has a huge portfolio, downtown of office, this on the office side, downtown office, and then suburban office, and they have a lot of traction for the suburban product, and they're getting deals done, and there seems to be, but this is for more maybe this more the not smaller office, but maybe it's a 10,000 square foot lease requirement. I tend to believe, I think we have seen this. I still think you're going to have law firms that need to be downtown, associations that need the DC address, investors that want to be in the gateway city, whether you're a lender or you're a foreign investor from overseas. So there still is, I think, a bifurcation between and being in a gateway city, for many tenants and investors as being downtown DC or being in DC. Whether it's Capitol Hill, East End, CBD, is still very different from being in Tyson's. And so I do think there's going to be some shift to the suburbs, and maybe that firm in DC then maybe it does have that spoke or that kind of satellite office out in the suburbs. But we don't see, I don't see firms really leaving DC and in mass or anything. And do view this more as a temporary, maybe a year or two accommodation versus a total change in demand.
So I had almost thought that this would be the return to the suburban office park of the 1980s, that people would move and shift, but that remains to be seen.
I think remains to be seen.
Yes. And before COVID, pre-COVID, there was so much money in the market. I mean, money flowing in from all over the world, wanting to buy properties in the US and making it very, very competitive in terms of acquisitions. Are the foreign investors still banging at our door to come into our major cities, to Chicago and New York and LA and DC and Miami?
Yes, they are. There is still, I mean, even the U.S. is still viewed as one of the safest places to invest money. So even though it's a very dynamic and ever-changing global geopolitical environment, the U.S. is still considered one of the best places, for investment. And again, that's over the next 5, 10 years. In one of our transactions recently here in DC, there was a lot of syndicator demand, and that operator syndicator, again for office, may have been based in, LA or DC or Chicago or New York, but a lot of their LP, their equity was coming from overseas, and it was diverse, whether it's German money or Middle Eastern money or Singapore money. So there is still demand for the right product. From foreign capital sources. It is down. I think clearly just because transaction volume is down, but we still are seeing an interest for investors for cash flowing deals, cash flowing and credit tenant, or the right multifamily deal in urban DC is going to get a lot of foreign investor interest.
Right. So Brent touched briefly on the election, the upcoming election, and what kind of impact do you think the election is going to have? I mean, if we have a Democrat elected or if we have our president reelected, what do you think the impact is going to be either way? Kassi, I'll start. I'll stay with you on this one for now.
Okay. I mean, I think the regulations for business are likely going to change. I think I should say for commercial, I'm going to try and tailor this to commercial real estate. You have the 1031 clause being talked about being materially changed by Biden. Many jurisdictions are looking at increasing real estate taxes for additional costs to subsidize and to supplement budgets where there's going to be shortfalls. There's a lot of fair housing, rent control issues that are in flux right now. So, and whether that's a function of the election, local decision-making powers, or just having to fill budget gaps, there is a lot of concern about the tax and regulatory space. Again, whether it's from increasing property taxes on properties to fill the budgets, to keeping more housing affordable and not having as many not have as many like rent stabilized apartments be converted to market. That's a big thing in New York right now. California is talking about getting rid of their Proposition 13, which is a 2% cap on property tax increases. And then, as we all know, DC at the end of September last year had almost a doubling of the transfer and recordation tax to 5%. So it's just gonna, I think as long as there's just more regulation and higher taxes, it's gonna directly affect values and investor interests in our industry.
Brent, give us your thoughts as well.
So I think no matter what happens in the election, I think Kassi's exactly right, and she hit it right on the head. Regulations and taxes, almost no matter what, are going to be an issue because of the pandemic and the added cost, the reduced revenue, right, particularly on the sales tax in April and May. And you've got to fill those holes vis-a-vis probably a property tax increase or some other method. So I think that will have an impact. If we change administrations, I think the 1031s are on the table. I think capital gains tax rates are on the table. I'm not sure ordinary income, what's going to happen there. I'm not sure they'll increase those. So I think there will be investors that maybe we're looking to transact in the near term, call it within 12 to 36 type month time frame. Maybe they accelerate that and try to bring that into 2020. If Trump pulls off a re-election, I still think taxes are going to be an issue because we've got to pay for this money that we're printing.
It's not free?
No, Barbara, I'll have a discussion with you and my children.
Okay, yeah, I'm not the accountant, so. You just go to the wall and you get money, right?
Yeah. We come to
Isn't
my
that
backyard.
right, Barb? I can go to your money machine and just draw it out. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, so when we talk about the banks and lending, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in terms of lending, the banks lending and investors, and where people are putting their money, because the stock market is on fire. Nobody's quite sure why. I was going to listen to another podcast today because it doesn't make sense. Business is distressed, but the market's going crazy. And so is the market impacting investors today? Are they hesitant to get into real estate, or would they rather keep their money liquid in the market? Kassi, you want to start with that one?
Sure. We've seen a discussion. I mean, I think from from the personal side, or the personal, smaller investor side. Yeah, I think it is a big concern that if you go into an illiquid investment such as real estate, how do you get out? How does it price? What happens if we have a U-turn with COVID, the election? So I think right now, in part the stock market is gaining. Obviously, we have the technology companies and Tesla that are just on fire. We have the Apple stock split. I mean, there's a lot of good news items out there. I personally think there's still a lot of stress in the system. A lot of the losses are not flowing through yet. I do think, though, it is a place where you're seeing increases. You're seeing quick returns. You're seeing continued growth. And it's a very liquid investment. You can buy Apple today and sell 20 minutes later. Versus real estate, there's a time and a cost and all these other unknowns. I know also some other of our clients, it's like, do you buy, some of these securities or bonds, and even though they're lower rates, again, still, do you buy, maybe a 4% bond right now, or a REIT that has a 4 or 5% all-in return, versus, going into some of these, perhaps a non-credit tenant deal or something in real estate where there's just a lot more risk, and maybe you're talking a couple more percentage points return, and maybe some longer term upside with cap rate, compression, for example, just isn't as certain, as it has been over the past couple of years. Kind of my initial thoughts.
I find it really interesting and fascinating. And, one of the other things that we talked about is the impact of a vaccine and when it's going to happen. And Brent, you touched on that briefly earlier. I mean, I've heard October, I've heard next year, I've heard 12 months, I've heard 24 months. And then there's the impact of how people will take the vaccine right out of the chutes, and what kind of impact that can.
So I think it'll be a positive lift, but it will be a slow impact. So I think people will be optimistic. It will help with consumer confidence if there is a vaccine. I think the issue, though, is to your point of how quickly can you roll out the vaccine and deliver it, and then also its efficacy, right? So if typically, on average, about 60% of the population gets vaccinated, and then about 60% efficacy. So I don't know those numbers. I'm not smart enough to do that, but 60% of 60% is less than half, right? So, is that really going to help? I'm not sure. I think it's going to be a vaccine, herd immunity, personal behavior and hygiene, as well as social distancing. Are we ever going to get rid of masks? I'm not sure. I hope so. I hate them, but it may be. I always liken it to my dad in the seatbelt. Didn't like wearing the seatbelt, but now he does, and he got used to it, and it's now a habit. So I'm not sure. I think the issue is more of it's going to come out, and it's not going to be binary in terms of changing behavior. It's going to be a slow to adopt, just like we were slow to adopt the masks and social distancing. And I would say others are still adapting to that, right? And we're 4 months into this, so it's going to take time.
Mask for us ladies is the latest fashion accessory. So, and it hides a multitude of wrinkles and other things. So I think it's unfortunate because I miss seeing people smile, yes, which is what I love about Zoom calls. You can actually see somebody's face, you can see their smiles, and otherwise you have to hope that they've got smiling eyes and you know what's going on.
Right.
So I have one other question for both Kassi and Brent, and that is, what is keeping you the busiest right now? And what is keeping you up at night in terms of how do I get through this?
Sure, I'll start off. So as you know, I'm very active in the debt markets, and we touched a little bit on lending. But our markets were basically shut down in March and April, and even through May. It came to a hard stop after the big MBA conference in February. It was very frothy and just very, very optimistic. Right now, lending is off, 60%. We've got some deals and clients and lenders, everyone's sort of hesitant to put their toe back in the water and to lend. And every deal, I think what we're seeing kind of keeps us up is the good deals and good sponsors are getting done. Banks are and life companies are pulling back leverage. Even with these historically low interest rates, it's still tough to get money, and underwriting is getting a little more stringent. The CMBS market's coming back, but again, that kind of higher leveraged finance company debt fund money is still very hard to get. And I mean, it was a real hard stop that we had in April and May. Then that obviously transitioned through to the transaction side. And I remember when I first started in the business, many years ago, one of the brokers had mentored me and said, the worst thing is a market with no transactions and a stalled market. And it's very true, because you can't. There's just a complete grind, and it's hard to know what's going to restart that. Like in '08, for example, it was hard to know what the catalyst was to really restart and get that confidence again. And to the question, I don't, to get that confidence and have lending and transactions going on all cylinders, that's the biggest question right now, is how do we get that confidence that once we open, once you make loans, once you, follow through with acquisitions and selling and buying, how do you know that the terms today are good 3 months from now? And that's just a big question mark, I think, that we have right now, which weighs on everybody's minds.
So Brent, what's your greatest challenge right now?
Well, I mean, Kassi touched on it a little bit. It's hard to get financing. It's hard to get deals done, and it's super, super competitive. So just trying to be top of mind with clients and sourcing situations and opportunities to take to clients. So I think I'd like to see whatever that catalyst is for consumer confidence. I'd like to see it, and investor confidence. I'd like to see it tonight. Actually, would be great, and I'd like to see us recover here.
I think we all would.
Yeah.
Here's a big round of applause for recovery soon.
Yes.
Jennifer, do we have any questions that have come in, or does anybody have anything that they would like to ask the panel while we have them online?
So yeah, I'd like to open it up to anybody. We've received lots of compliments on the chat, but no questions yet that I see here. So anybody who has a question, please feel free to speak up.
That means Kassi and Brent were just awesome and covered everything. Kristen, I'm sorry, you had a question.
No, this is Kirsten F. from Career Atlanta. Thank you so much for extending the invitation to the other member chapters as well. If I have someone who's interested in making an office purchase specifically, and they're not seeing pricing that looks like it's like enough of a discount off of where the market was, should they go ahead with that purchase, or should they hold off?
In my opinion, I think it depends on what the profile of the office is, the office building is. If it's credit tenant and a larger transaction, there may not be a discount. One of our deals actually is going off at a premium because, to Brett's point, there's fewer transactions. And so you're having a real competitive environment. And in this case, pricing actually increased over what we thought the ask would be. If it is a value add, maybe a deal where there is a little bit more distress, and it's not exactly, if he or she is like, oh, I should get 15%, and maybe they're only getting 10%, maybe that's worth it. Because I still think there is a bid-ask gap, because a lot of sellers, maybe don't want to give 15, but maybe they're like, hey, I want to just it depends if they have a timing issue, with their fund or other allocation issues. So I would say be flexible. And if it's one of the more value add light, profiles, there may be more of an opportunity there for your client to make a deal.
Fabulous, thanks.
And your timing too will also depend.
Good point.
Thank you.
As I believe you all have Kassi and Brent's email addresses, and they're happy to answer questions from you or get involved with any of your transactions to help make things happen and move our economy forward. So please keep in touch. We would love to hear from you.
I'll go ahead and ask a question, and if nobody else has one right now, I know you both mentioned real estate taxes and the possibility of real estate taxes increasing to help out with budgets and different areas. And for office, industrial, retail, you can pass that on to your tenant. Multifamily, you can only pass that along through rents. In most places, there are some cityscapes where you can, but it's rare for multifamily. And so, and it's difficult right now in multifamily to raise rents. So I'm just curious if you think that's more of a concern for investors in multifamily, or if you think maybe the jurisdictions will recognize that and not increase real estate taxes as much for multifamily versus the other asset classes.
That's a great point, Jennifer. Absolutely a great point. I do think there needs to be in Newmark. We do think there needs to be a conversation between the public officials and some of these local, lobbying groups, or developers or major property owners, because there has to be some sort of medium to meet in the middle. Because as you know, if you raise taxes and there's another expense, for example, that the multifamily owner has to pay, then maybe you're not going to be making as many improvements, or you're not going to be making as many capital investments. It's going to affect the tenants very, in an adverse way. Generally the jurisdictions, don't differentiate between property types. It's just, just commercial property tax across the board. And it's also going to be a problem for developers. So if the developers have to eat the property tax, or if there's a land piece where you're trying to land bank and hold it, then it's going to make construction projects a lot more expensive as well, as that investor is going to have to, pay that tax. I think you're right. It's definitely going to have a disproportionate impact to the property type, and I think it's a really good point for multifamily, especially because a lot of times, who will inevitably bear that burden would be the residents, if a developer is forced to shoulder too much of that, or an owner would be forced to shoulder too much of that hike.
Yeah, and other operating type real estate, right? Like I think of seniors housing that doesn't get passed through to the residents. Hotels. Yep. And then there's some that, office tenants, if you're negotiating a new lease or something, we start to see caps. We've seen that in retail actually recently, with a major grocer we're financing. There's expense caps and there's real estate tax caps. Hadn't really seen that as much, prevalently before. So that may occur, some of these office tenants, that may be a new clause, as is some leases. As for the commercial side, you're starting to see pandemic clauses and operating clauses, which never existed 5 months ago. I think it will be addressed more so on the commercial side as well. And then, the base year limits, right? I think we'll see those come in where your base year, which is your first year in your lease, that will be the maximum you'll pay, plus some nominal increase.
Cap.
Yeah.
So we're talking about taxes going up in order to help pay for all the money we're printing. Do you believe there's going to be another relief package coming out to help the people who are unemployed as well as businesses?
I'm not sure they get it done before the election. Maybe in a lame duck session they will, but I don't think it's going to be before November.
Wow. So what are your crystal ball predictions for our economic recovery? And what asset class? I keep thinking manufacturing is going to be a big winner here. But where do you think the recovery is going to come first?
I think there's going to be continued strength in some of these more specialty areas. The data centers have already been on fire. Some of these healthcare centers, especially locally here in Maryland, we've got the I-270 corridor with all the life sciences and biotech, and a lot of those companies are closely aligned with NIH. And I think medical office is going to become more demanding. Again, people aren't going to the hospital or don't want to go to the hospital. And grocery anchored, centers, and credit tenant deals. I think those are going to be continued winners. And I just with retail, I think it's a huge question mark. It's going to continue for some time until we see these bankruptcies, either on the corporate side, small business, unfortunately personal. But I think that's going to start to ripple through if the economy doesn't get back on track with a continued growth path. Because once bankruptcies start hitting, then you're going to have corporate job losses, right? We haven't really had corporate job losses so far. Major layoffs on large scales like we did in 2008. So I think economic growth has got to continue at some pace.
Yeah, I like the life science sector, and that was on fire before COVID hit, and it continues to be, and actually has experienced some tailwinds because of COVID. Medical office space, that trend also was already in process in terms of taking the delivery out of the hospital and into these remote buildings. So I like that space. I also think the senior housing is going to be a great space to be in terms of they've been maybe unfairly kind of hammered in the market. Costs are up. There's a labor shortage, right? The unemployment benefit made it difficult. There was a labor shortage going into COVID. Then you add the $600 a week, exacerbated that situation. So I like senior housing. There's a silver tsunami is here, and I think the pandemic is going to be a tailwind for them coming out. So I like that. I like that space as well.
Yeah, baby boomers aren't getting any younger, and I think there's a real big need for upscale senior housing for a lot of baby boomers. I'm working with a client right now on that. So yes, Jennifer.
We do have a request that came in from our participants. Marilyn Donnelly, thank you for your request here. She's asking if either Kassi or Brent could comment on the Facebook lease of the Harding Post Office in New York City this week as part of the discussion of urban versus suburban.
Wow.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. And I guess I don't know a lot about the specific deal, but just stepping back and thinking about New York City, there's been a flight to the suburbs there in particular. Yeah, so that's an interesting play, and I'll be interested to see how that plays out. But I think, to me, again, getting back to my earlier commentary, I think we'll trend back towards kind of 2018, 29 trends of people will want to live and work near each other, and so I'm guessing Facebook is betting on that.
Yeah, and I have heard just kind of some incidental stories and data that in some places, like I think Jennifer pointed out, the rents for at least multifamily aren't going up as much, and as more people are flocking to suburbs, whether it's multifamily or office, rental rates are going to come in. Concessions are going to go up. I think it's going to be continued, certain tenants that want to be there and then they make a commitment to it, whether it's personal, multifamily, or business, are going to be able to get really good deals. Not knowing the specifics of the Facebook deal, but I would have to imagine that that's coming into play as some of these urban, locations, want to keep tenants.
I see another comment here. I put my glasses on to read it. We have a big Google deal in Atlanta that was landed last week. That's from Kirsten. Congratulations. Is that your deal?
That's wonderful.
Well, unfortunately, that was not my deal, but Cousins Property, large REIT in Atlanta, based in Atlanta.
Yeah.
It was leaked last week that they did a big office deal with Google, so I was piling on to the comment about the Facebook deal.
But I had also heard that Google was telling their employees, you can live wherever you want. And a lot of people are leaving, California, moving east because it's less expensive, or their families are back east. And so these big deals that are getting done are really incredible when you think about the fact that they're saying, you're happy working at home, keep doing it. So it's a flip-flop in terms of direction. Jennifer, do we have anything else? I think we're getting close to wrapping up.
Yeah, we are. So I'm just about to say it's probably a good time to wrap up. So I want to say thank you so much. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Kassi. We really appreciate you sharing your insights with us. It's a very interesting time, and this is a very pertinent topic, and it's great to that you're able to cover so many aspects and markets and product types. So thank you. We really appreciate it. And there's going to be a lot more to talk about going forward with everything going on with the election and just seeing what happens with the vaccine. So we'll stay tuned and hope to keep in touch. And as if anybody has any questions, again, either right now or a month down the road, 2 months down the road, please reach out to our panelists here. They're a great resource and would be happy to help you out. So they welcome you reaching out to them.
Yes.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank everybody for tuning in. It's wonderful to see so many wonderful familiar faces. I love these Zoom room meetings. So thank you so much. And Kassi and Brent, you were fantastic. So much knowledge.
Thank you, guys.
And this was recorded, so if there's anything that you want to listen to again, it's going to be available. But
yes, I'll send out the link to the recording. It'll be posted on the Crew DC YouTube page. Follow us on social media. We're very modern these days. We got lots of stuff out there. So thanks, everybody.
Great.
Have a great afternoon.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Take care.